Chapter 6. Life's Journey. Prudence whipped the rake under the cherry tree and scraped out more dirt than fallen fruit and leaves. Lots of fruit had ripened overnight. She would have to pick them after she finished raking the yard. She paused to pick a cherry and tossed it into her mouth. Its tartness didn't sit well with her. She spat it into the gully and the fowls tumbled over each other to get to it. The repetitive grating sound of the prongs of the rake through the damp earth and stones, the cackling of hens, the cheeping of chicks, the cooing of distant pigeons, the occasional crowing of a rooster and the voices on the radio enlivened the morning. She hummed as she whipped the rake across the yard, collecting leaves, pieces of dried twigs and dirt. The fowls flapped behind the rake, pecking at anything that they thought was edible. She'd already done Constance's job by feeding them, but had long realized that their bellies were never full, no matter the amount of food they ate or the number of times they ate. As she whipped the rake back and forth, she heard Constance's voice playing in her head. "Your kindness is going to drive you into poverty. Learn to say no. Look at me. You ever see the world and him wife coming up here to borrow anything from me? I don't say you can't help out somebody, but if they not working, how you expect them to pay you back? If you give them things all the time, they will never try to help themselves. And some of them don't deserve any help." Laughter erupted from Prudence, scattering the fowls. Constance is a good one to talk. No matter what she say, she not much different from all the people who line up for me to lend them something, and no matter how much I help them, it is not enough. She hissed her teeth and tried to snag stubborn leaves from under the back staircase. "Everybody take my kindness for stupidity," she snapped. "I am not stupid." She straightened and slammed the prongs of the rake into the soft earth and rested her forehead on the handle. "Everybody take advantage of me. When you too kind, this is what happen," she muttered. "Miss Prudence, lend me $500. Miss Prudence, lend me $1,000. She mimicked the voices of the borrowers. "And I like a fool always lend it to them. You will get it next week. Next week. Next week never come, most of the times." Constance has a point, though. But how can I have something and somebody has nothing and I don't help them out? Her audience gave disinterested clucks, cheeps and the occasional cock-a-doodle-doo. "People don't understand how hard I had to work in the cold to make a decent living to prevent myself from going on pauper roll," she muttered. She resumed her raking, whipping the rake faster and faster across the damp earth. In 1968, when a friend had suggested that they migrate to Canada, she'd been ready for that adventure. She'd been young, educated and curious, and had grabbed the opportunity to earn some money to help her parents and herself and to see the world. It had taken her some time to get used to her new home. There were many times when she'd thought about returning to Jamaica, but she'd persevered. The racism hadn't bothered her much. She knew that she was black, very black. She'd grown up being teased by children about her being as black as tar, being as black as night and being black like Mars Ezra Black Hog. Therefore, the gawking and the slurs that children and adults occasionally threw her way had bounced off her back. She'd held her head high and moved right along. She was there for a purpose, she'd told herself, and had kept that purpose in mind. It had been the difficulty in finding the job that she'd wanted that had frustrated her. She'd done countless odd jobs before she'd finally got a teaching job in one of the First Nation communities. "All that I went through to get a few dollars, and they want me to come home and hand it out like Mrs. Claus." Prudence chortled. Mrs. Claus? She was Mrs. Nobody. For all the years God had put her on the earth, she'd married nobody. She'd come close. She'd met Rob on a bus. They'd sat beside each other. He'd been coming from work and she'd been coming from the supermarket. They'd exchanged numbers, and as they'd talked over the subsequent weeks, they'd developed a friendship. He'd come over one Saturday morning and he'd never left, until he returned home to Guyana. Before he'd come into her life, she'd almost given up on men after she'd realized that the ones she'd dated had meant her no good, long after she'd invested in them. Rob was not like the others, she'd convinced herself. She'd found no fault with him, except that he'd never once asked her to marry him, and she hadn't believed that it was appropriate for her to suggest it. They'd lived together for 25 years. As he'd neared retirement, he'd started to talk about going back home. He hadn't asked her to go with him, and she'd had no intention to go with him. He'd returned home several times and he'd never asked her to travel with him, and she'd returned home to Jamaica over the years and had never asked him to travel with her. He'd always been busy, working like he could finish all the work in Canada, she'd told Constance. Constance never liked him. She never liked any man who got close to her. They are up to no good, she'd often warned her. Want to move in on you, and as soon as you blink, they take everything and leave you on your face. Whenever Constance had visited her in Canada, she hadn't given Rob the time of day. Every time he'd tried to be friendly, she'd spurned his efforts. Rob had often said that the problem with Constance was that she believed that she was better than other people and her complexion was fooling her. Prudence had rejected that suggestion. Rob didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know Constance as well as she did, she'd told him. Prudence paused in her raking to shake one leg, then the other. Her legs were a bit stiff. Probably because it had been raining every day for the last 6 months, sometimes at morning, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes at nights, sometimes for days. The rain had cooled down the place, but her arthritis was allergic to the cold. She'd discovered that while she'd lived in Canada. I wonder if Rob dead or alive, she mused. They'd not kept in touch after he'd returned home. The last real talk that they'd had was during his last months in Canada, and that talk hadn't been civil. She'd returned home from shopping to see him pacing around the living room. Her practice when she came off the road was to change out of her street clothes. That night he'd stopped her. He'd wanted to talk, he'd said. They'd been used to talking about everything and everybody, while enjoying whatever meal he'd prepared that evening. His tone of voice had told her that their chat would have been different that night. Over supper, he'd talked about what was on his mind and she'd listened for a while. He'd made up his mind to go home. She'd suspected that, since he'd started shipping off barrels months before and not said a word to her. But she'd soon learnt that there was much more to be settled. He'd had his mind on his share of her house. That man was probably at the early stage of Alzheimer's. Prudence snapped and swung the rake at an errant leaf. The muscles in her shoulder strained from her exertions. She leaned on the side of the house, clutching the handle of the rake. The mist was lifting and she could see the outlines of the houses on the opposite hill. Everybody should be up from morning, she thought, except Constance. Still enjoying her beauty sleep, she murmured, before returning to her musings. The last time she'd seen Rob, he'd been clutching the golden head of his walking stick and glaring at her. She'd had her problems, but he'd had more: hypertension, diabetes, arthritis, and heart problems. The strapping black man she'd met on the bus was not the same person who'd returned to Guyana. He'd been grey, balding, and bad-tempered. Prudence laughed. It started out as a chuckle, then a belly laugh. It took her a while to control herself. "My house," she exclaimed. "The one that I slaved for in all kinds of weather. The one that I alone pay my mortgage for." She tinkered with her glasses that hung from its beaded chain around her neck and rested on her breasts. "The only thing that Rob contribute to the house was food money, and he wanted his share of my house," she said, and shook her head. They'd quarreled for weeks, and when he'd seen that she would not budge, he'd said that he would consult a lawyer. Afterwards, he'd not mentioned the house again, and 6 months later, he'd left her with the memories which she'd chosen to keep of their 25 years together.